Welcome to Strategic Affairs. In the heart of London, where history and modern politics collide, an unusual battle began to unfold. It wasn't fought with weapons or armies, but with blueprints, council votes, secret intelligence files, and whispers of espionage. At the center of this storm was a piece of land once belonging to the Royal Mint, and a plan by China to build its largest embassy in Europe, right there in Tower Hamlets. What seemed at first like a construction project soon grew into a diplomatic crisis, a security nightmare, and a test of Britain's political will. The story began quietly. Years earlier, when Beijing started preparing for a bigger and more prominent presence in London, the Chinese government wanted a new embassy that would not only serve as a consulate and administrative hub, but would also symbolize China's rise as a global power. The current embassy in Portland Place was no longer enough. It was outdated, too small, and unable to handle the massive flow of consular requests, diplomatic meetings, and cultural events. A grander, more secure, and more visible complex was the answer. And so the Royal Mint site was chosen, a historic, strategic, and central location. But from the very beginning, the project stirred unease. To the Chinese it was about pride and necessity. To many in Britain it looked like a Trojan horse. Intelligence experts, local residents and politicians immediately saw the potential risks. The site was dangerously close to sensitive government buildings, the financial district, and major transport hubs, for a country already wary of foreign surveillance. The thought of a massive embassy filled with advanced communications systems, underground levels, and possible spy infrastructure was alarming. Embassies are by international law considered sovereign territory. That means the ground they sit on is legally part of the foreign nation they represent. In practice, this gives countries an unusual amount of freedom to operate without oversight from the host government. During the Cold War, embassies became infamous for hiding listening devices, intercepting communications, and running covert operations. In the modern era, those tactics have evolved into cyber attacks, data monitoring, and advanced surveillance. Placing such a powerful embassy right in London's heart felt, to some, like handing an adversary a front row seat to Britain's secrets. The whispers of espionage began almost instantly. Security services quietly prepared assessments warning of the possible dangers. Classified documents, never made public but referenced later by insiders, revealed concerns about hacking, covert surveillance, and intelligence gathering. The embassy, in the eyes of these experts, could be more than just a building. It could become a nerve center for digital warfare. For a Britain already cautious about Chinese involvement in its 5G networks and technological infrastructure, this was another red flag. Yet while intelligence officers voiced alarm, diplomats saw another side of the dilemma. Blocking the embassy outright could spark a diplomatic storm. China was not just any country, it was one of Britain's biggest trading partners. London depended on Beijing for investments, for student exchanges, for cultural ties, and for trade. Worth billions, rejecting the embassy could look like open hostility. It could bring retaliation against British businesses in China, sour relations for years, and drag Britain into a deeper conflict between China and its Western allies. The government, therefore, found itself torn between two powerful fears, the fear of espionage and the fear of diplomatic collapse. On the ground, the people of Tower Hamlets had their own concerns. For residents, this wasn't about high-level geopolitics but about daily life. They worried about constant protests, heavy police presence, security lockdowns, and the disruption of an already stretched neighborhood. Tower Hamlets was densely populated, with housing shortages, congestion, and strained public services. Many locals argued that the Royal Mint site could serve far better as affordable housing or community spaces. Instead, they feared it would become a fortress guarded by armed police, a magnet for demonstrations, and a source of daily tension. Journalists began digging deeper, uncovering details about the embassy's design. The plans included multiple underground levels, fortified walls, and advanced communications infrastructure. Officially, these were standard security measures for a modern diplomatic compound. Unofficially, they fueled speculation that the site was being built for more than diplomacy. Could the underground sections serve as secret data centers? Could the reinforced structures hide surveillance equipment? Was this truly an embassy, or was it something else, a spy hub in disguise? As the story spread, the public debate grew. Louder local councils received petitions, parliament members raised questions, and newspapers published exposes. The controversy became impossible to ignore. Britain's relationship with China was already strained. Tensions over Hong Kong's freedoms, allegations of human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and the banning of Huawei from the UK's 5G rollout had cast a shadow over bilateral ties. Now, the embassy project threatened to push relations to a breaking point. Inside Whitehall, behind closed doors, the arguments were fierce. Some officials warned that approving the embassy would be like inviting surveillance into Britain's capital. Others insisted that rejecting it would isolate London from Beijing and harm the economy. Intelligence briefings collided with trade reports. National security clashed with global diplomacy. It was a balancing act, but the scales refused to settle. Meanwhile, China's response was sharp. Officials dismissed allegations of espionage as absurd and politically motivated. They argued that the embassy was simply a necessity, not a conspiracy. Statements from Beijing framed the resistance as evidence of rising anti-China sentiment in British politics. They warned that such hostility could damage relations and undermine cooperation. To China, the embassy was a symbol of respect and recognition. Refusing it was, in their eyes, an insult. This tension soon spilled into the media. British headlines painted the embassy as a potential spy base, while Chinese outlets described the controversy as an unfair attack. Commentators compared it to Cold War paranoia. Security experts called it a test of Britain's independence in handling China, and ordinary citizens found themselves watching what looked less like a construction dispute and more like the opening moves of a new geopolitical confrontation. By the time the planning application was reviewed, the controversy had already taken on a life of its own. The Royal Mint site was no longer just a piece of land. It had become a battleground of trust, a symbol of the world's changing order, and a reminder that even in a city like London, the struggles of global powers could reach straight into the streets. The embassy plan was still on the table, but it was already more than that. It was a test of Britain's future direction. Would it bow to pressure and risk its security, or would it stand firm and risk its economy? Every choice carried consequences, and every outcome promised new challenges. As part 1 of this story closes, the stage is set. A quiet site in Tower Hamlets has become the center of global intrigue. The plans are drawn, the warnings are written, and the world is watching. Britain must decide not just about a building, but about the meaning of its security, its diplomacy, and its sovereignty in the 21st century. The Royal Mint site was once a place where coins of the realm were struck, a location filled with Britain's legacy, but now, its future was being written in secret meetings and heated council chambers. By the time the proposal for China's new embassy reached the desks of local decision-makers, the controversy had already spilled out of private whispers and into public arguments. The planning application was detailed, running through technical reports, architectural sketches, and statements of purpose. On paper, it looked like any other modern embassy, a large complex with facilities for administration, consular services, and cultural events. Yet everyone knew this was not just any embassy. This was China's, and in the climate of rising mistrust between Beijing and London, every line in the blueprints felt like a coded message. Leaks began surfacing in the British press, anonymous sources from within government and security agencies, that spoke of grave concerns about the scale of the embassy. They hinted at fears that the complex could be used to monitor communications across London. Some pointed out its proximity to major transport hubs in the City of London's financial institutions. Was it simply a coincidence that the embassy's location gave it a vantage point over so many of Britain's most sensitive networks? Or was it part of a careful calculation by Beijing? In Tower Hamlets, opposition hardened. Local residents packed into meetings, voicing their frustrations, one after another. They spoke about their fears, the increase in security checks, the heavy police presence, the potential for protests turning violent, and the disruption to everyday life. Some simply wanted affordable homes to replace the vacant site. To them, the idea that the land would instead become a fortress for a foreign power was an insult. They argued that their community should not pay the price for global rivalries. Protests soon followed. Outside council buildings, small but passionate crowds gathered, holding signs that read "No spy base in Tower Hamlets" and "Homes not embassies." Activists warned that approving the project would turn their neighborhood into a flashpoint for international disputes. They pointed to past demonstrations outside the Chinese embassy in Portland Place, where protests over Hong Kong and Tibet often drew hundreds. If such scenes moved to Tower Hamlets, the disruption could be far worse. Parliament too began to stir. Members of Parliament raised questions demanding clarity on whether the government had conducted a full security review. Some accused ministers of downplaying the risks in the name of diplomacy. Others went further, arguing that allowing the embassy would be a betrayal of national security. For them, the issue was simple. Britain could not risk handing China such a powerful base in its capital city. Yet within the government, nothing was simple. Trade officials warned of the consequences if the embassy were blocked. China, they reminded everyone, had leverage. British universities hosted tens of thousands of Chinese students, whose tuition fees helped keep campuses afloat. British companies exported billions of pounds worth of goods to China each year. A diplomatic clash could threaten all of this, and in a post-Brexit Britain searching for new trading partners, alienating Beijing was no small risk. In the media, the story grew even louder. Newspapers published exposés suggesting the embassy could include underground chambers and high-tech communications hubs. Satellite images of the site were poured over as though they held clues to hidden secrets. Talk shows invited former intelligence officers, who spoke grimly about the dangers of underestimating China's ambitions. Some even compared the embassy to Soviet compounds of the Cold War, where embassies doubled as command centers for espionage. Beijing, meanwhile, pushed back hard. Chinese diplomats in London gave statements dismissing the allegations as baseless paranoia. They insisted the embassy was purely for administrative and cultural purposes, not for spying. They accused the British press of fueling anti-China hysteria and warned that continued hostility could damage bilateral ties. Behind the scenes, Chinese officials pressed their case directly to British ministers, making it clear that rejection of the embassy would not be taken lightly. This tug-of-war left Britain's leaders trapped in a dilemma. Intelligence services were whispering warnings. Local communities were demanding rejection. The press was stoking fears. Yet the realities of global economics and diplomacy weighed heavily on Downing Street. How could Britain balance national security with the need for international cooperation? Every option carried danger, and every path forward risked a political cost. The more the debate dragged on, the more it became clear that this was no longer about one building. It was about trust. Could Britain trust China to keep its embassy within the bounds of diplomacy? Could China trust Britain to treat it fairly and with respect, despite the growing chill between East and West? Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair, and in this case, it was already wearing thin. Then came the turning point. Tower Hamlets Council convened a critical meeting to consider the planning application. The hall was packed. Activists, journalists, and officials crowded into the chamber. The atmosphere was electric, filled with tension and anticipation. One by one, council members spoke, weighing the evidence and the risks. Local voices spoke of disruption, of fear, of the need for housing instead of a foreign compound. Security arguments were raised, citing the potential dangers of hosting such a massive embassy in such a sensitive location. When the vote was finally taken, the decision shocked Beijing. Tower Hamlets Council rejected the plan. On paper, the reasons were tied to local planning issues, concerns about scale, impact on the community, and disruption. But everyone knew the real weight behind the decision was political and security-driven. The message was clear. London was not ready to welcome China's Grand Embassy in its current form. The rejection sent ripples across the world. In Britain, it was hailed by some as a victory for common sense and national security. Critics of China celebrated the decision as proof that local democracy could stand up to global pressure. But others worried about the fallout. Could this trigger a diplomatic backlash? Would Beijing retaliate against British interests? The fear was real, and the future uncertain. China's reaction was swift and stern. Official statements described the rejection as disappointing and politically motivated. Chinese media framed it as yet another example of Western hostility. Diplomats hinted at consequences for bilateral relations. The embassy, they reminded Britain, was not just about convenience, it was about dignity and respect. Refusing it, they argued, was a direct affront to China's global standing. Behind closed doors, British officials braced for retaliation. Would Beijing restrict visas for British citizens? Would it impose barriers on trade? Would British companies operating in China suddenly face new obstacles? The rejection of the embassy seemed like a small act in planning terms, but in diplomatic terms, it carried enormous weight. For London, the decision also marked the beginning of a new chapter. The embassy debate was not over, it was only paused. China still needed a larger base, and Britain still needed to find a way to manage its relationship with Beijing. The question now was, what would happen next? Would there be a compromise, a new site, a new design, or would the controversy deepen into a long-term standoff? The people of Tower Hamlets breathed a sigh of relief, at least temporarily. Their community would not, for now, become the site of a diplomatic fortress. But even they knew the battle was not truly finished. When powerful nations clash, local decisions can always be overturned, renegotiated, or revisited. The embassy might return in another form, another place, another time. As part 2 of this story ends, the embassy controversy had moved from a blueprint to a geopolitical storm. What started as an architectural proposal had become a symbol of mistrust between two powerful nations. Britain had drawn a line, but China was not the kind of power to accept such outcomes quietly. The stage was set for the conflict to deepen. The rejection of the embassy project by Tower Hamlets Council did not end the matter, it ignited it. For Beijing, the refusal was more than a local planning decision. It was a humiliation. China, a rising superpower, had been denied what it saw as its rightful diplomatic presence in the heart of London. Within hours of the vote, Chinese state media carried sharp headlines, accusing Britain of politicizing the process. Commentators described the rejection as a deliberate insult, a symbol of Britain bowing to anti-China sentiment. In London, officials scrambled to contain the fallout. The Foreign Office issued careful statements, stressing that the decision had been made at the local level, not by central government. But no one in Beijing was fooled. The symbolism was too strong to be ignored. Behind the scenes, British diplomats reported rising anger from their Chinese counterparts. Meetings became tense. Every word weighed heavily. Every gesture scrutinized. The stories spilled far beyond diplomatic circles. Newspapers around the world reported the embassy saga as a new flashpoint in UK-China relations. In Washington, some American commentators praised Britain for standing firm. In Europe, analysts debated whether the move was bold leadership or reckless provocation. And in Beijing, the narrative was spun into a tale of Western hostility. Another example of a world that did not want China to rise, but beneath the headlines. Another layer of the story was unfolding, one that the public only glimpsed in fragments. British intelligence agencies, already wary of China's growing influence, began to monitor the situation even more closely. Officials whispered of potential retaliation in cyberspace. Could Chinese hackers target Britain's infrastructure, financial institutions, or government systems in response to the embassy rejection? These were not far-fetched scenarios. They were real possibilities, and the warnings carried urgency. Meanwhile, Chinese officials explored their own options. Building an embassy was not just about diplomacy, it was about symbolism, prestige, and power. For Beijing, abandoning the project was unthinkable. Instead, the question became how to proceed in the face of British resistance. Some advocated confrontation, suggesting strong retaliatory measures. Others argued for patience, believing Britain's need for Chinese trade and investment would eventually soften its stance. Inside Britain, the debate grew louder. Security hawks insisted that the rejection was proof the country had finally woken up to the dangers of Chinese influence. They pointed to earlier scandals, from concerns over Huawei's role in Britain's 5G network to accusations of Chinese interference in academia and politics. To them, the embassy controversy was not an isolated issue. It was part of a pattern, a larger struggle for control and security. But business leaders warned of consequences. They reminded the government that China was one of Britain's largest trading partners. Billions of pounds in exports, thousands of jobs, and countless university places depended on the relationship. A prolonged standoff over the embassy could damage all of this. For them, the rejection of the embassy was a risky gamble, one that could backfire on an already fragile economy. Public opinion, too, was divided. Some saw the embassy as a threat, a potential spy hub disguised as diplomacy. Others saw the rejection as dangerous, a decision that might provoke a superpower unnecessarily. And in Tower Hamlets, opinions remained as mixed as ever. Many residents celebrated the council's decision, but others worried about what it might mean for their community if tensions escalated. After all, diplomatic conflicts have a way of spilling into the lives of ordinary people. As weeks passed, the embassy controversy took on the shape of a chess match. Each move was calculated, each response measured. Britain had made its opening move by blocking the embassy. Now it waited to see what China would do. And Beijing, known for its long-term strategies, was unlikely to make its counter-move hastily. Rumors began to swirl of back-channel negotiations. Some claimed that British officials were quietly proposing alternative sites for the embassy, hoping to find a compromise. Others suggested that China was using its economic influence as leverage, hinting at restrictions on British companies operating in the mainland. None of this was confirmed, but the whispers alone were enough to stir unease. Then came a new development. Reports emerged that China was considering scaling back the original design, proposing a smaller, less imposing embassy. Officially, the idea was to address local concerns, but many suspected it was a tactical retreat, a way to re-enter the conversation without appearing to concede defeat. Still, even a smaller embassy raised the same fundamental questions. Could Britain afford to trust China's intentions? The security community remained adamant. Former intelligence officers appeared on television warning that embassies had long been used as bases for espionage. They recalled stories from the Cold War, when Soviet embassies were packed with surveillance equipment and intelligence operatives. Why should China's embassy be any different? For them, the issue was not about size or scale, it was about strategy. A single building, no matter its design, could become a hub of surveillance and influence. Diplomatic tensions escalated further when protests erupted outside China's current embassy in Portland Place. Demonstrators carried signs linking the embassy saga to broader concerns: Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang. Each protest, each headline, reinforced the perception that Britain's relationship with China was deteriorating. Beijing, in turn, accused London of allowing anti-China sentiment to flourish unchecked. Meanwhile, the United States watched closely. For Washington, Britain's embassy controversy was another sign of the global struggle against Beijing's influence. American officials privately encouraged Britain to stand firm, framing the rejection as a victory for the Western alliance. But some in London worried about becoming a pawn in a larger rivalry. Was Britain acting in its own interests, or was it being pushed into a confrontation on behalf of others? The longer the controversy lasted, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary diplomatic dispute. The embassy project had become a stage upon which larger questions were being played out: the balance of power between East and West, the role of local communities in global affairs, and the limits of trust between nations. The building itself was still unbuilt, just lines on paper, yet its shadow already loomed large over London, over Britain, and over the fragile fabric of international diplomacy. As part 3 of this story closes, the embassy saga stands at a crossroads. Neither side has backed down. Britain insists on protecting its national security. China insists on its right to build the embassy it desires. Each side watches the other, waiting for the next move, knowing that whatever happens will shape not just the fate of a building in Tower Hamlets, but the future of relations between two of the world's most influential nations. The question now is clear. When power, pride, and politics collide in the heart of London, who will give way first? The months after the rejection of the embassy plan revealed just how deeply the controversy had cut into the heart of UK-China relations. The site at the Royal Mint remained silent, untouched, its future uncertain. But the silence was deceptive, for behind the scenes, governments, diplomats, and intelligence agencies were far from still. In Beijing, the refusal became a matter of national pride. For a country that places enormous value on symbols of status and respect, the denial of the embassy was seen as more than a practical setback. It was an insult, a reminder that even in the 21st century, Western nations could still stand in the way of China's ambitions. State media began to weave a narrative of injustice, portraying Britain as hostile, hypocritical, and unwilling to treat China as an equal power. The propaganda worked. Among the Chinese public, anger toward Britain rose. Social media carried thousands of posts calling for retaliation. Some suggested sanctions on British companies. Others demanded that China restrict visas for UK citizens or tighten access to Chinese markets. What had begun as a planning dispute in Tower Hamlets was now shaping the perceptions of millions. In London, the government faced a difficult balancing act. Officials could not ignore the warnings of security experts. They had heard the briefings, seen the intelligence, and understood that the risks of espionage were real. But they also knew that Britain could not afford to push China too far. Trade, investment, and global cooperation depended on at least a working relationship. To cut ties completely would be reckless. This tension was visible in every statement the government made. Ministers stressed the importance of constructive engagement with China, even as they reiterated that national security would always come first. To many observers, this language sounded like an attempt to walk a tightrope, assuring both hawks and doves, while committing fully to neither side. As the weeks turned into months, speculation grew about possible compromises. Would the embassy be relocated to another part of London? Would it be redesigned to appear less imposing, less fortress-like? Or would Britain hold its ground, knowing that any concession might appear as weakness? At the same time, journalists continued to investigate the proposed site. They published reports highlighting underground chambers, communication facilities, and reinforced structures in the embassy's plans. While China dismissed these reports as exaggerated, they fueled public fears. To many Britons, the embassy began to look less like a diplomatic mission and more like a secretive intelligence hub waiting to be activated. The controversy also spilled into the wider relationship between the UK and China. Debates in Parliament grew more heated. Lawmakers cited the embassy saga while pushing for stricter rules on foreign investment, tighter monitoring of Chinese-owned businesses, and greater scrutiny of academic ties with Chinese institutions. Each policy discussion seemed to circle back to the same question: could China be trusted? Meanwhile, international voices added fuel to the fire. The United States continued to quietly encourage Britain to stand firm. In speeches and private meetings, American officials framed the embassy issue as part of a larger global struggle against authoritarian influence. They urged London not to compromise, warning that China's embassy would be a Trojan horse. In the heart of the capital, European countries paid close attention. Some saw Britain's stance as courageous, a demonstration of independence. Others worried that it was reckless, especially at a time when the continent needed stable relations with Beijing. Across the world, the embassy debate was becoming the symbol of how nations grappled with China's rise, whether to engage, resist, or find a fragile middle ground. Inside Tower Hamlets, life continued. But for many residents, the global headlines were surreal. A local decision about land use had escalated into a matter of global diplomacy. Some residents expressed pride, believing their community had stood up to a superpower. Others worried about becoming collateral in a larger geopolitical battle. What if protests, surveillance, or even cyber attacks disrupted their daily lives? For them, the embassy was not just an abstract political symbol, it was something that could reshape their neighborhood. As the saga unfolded, one thing became increasingly clear: the embassy controversy had changed the conversation about China. In Britain, no longer was the debate confined to trade deals or human rights. Now it touched on national security, community life, and the very future of Britain's place in the world. The embassy had become a lens through which broader anxieties were magnified. By the end of the year, there was still no resolution. The Royal Mint site remained fenced off, its future undecided. Diplomats continued their careful exchanges. Intelligence officers continued their monitoring, and the public continued to argue. Each side claimed the moral high ground. Britain insisted it was defending its people and its sovereignty. China insisted it was being unfairly targeted and disrespected. Yet beneath the rhetoric, both sides understood a hard truth: The embassy was never just about bricks and mortar. It was about power. It was about trust, or the lack of it. And it was about a new world order where old rules no longer applied, and where every decision carried global consequences. For Britain, the controversy forced a reckoning. Could it balance security with diplomacy, sovereignty with global influence, and economic needs with political values? For China, the embassy was a test of its ability to project power abroad without sparking backlash. And for the world, the dispute offered a glimpse of the quiet but fierce battles shaping international politics. As this story closes, one image remains: a patch of land in London, empty but loaded with meaning, a site where two nations collided, where global ambitions met local resistance, and where the future of diplomacy was rewritten. The Royal Mint may one day host an embassy, or perhaps something entirely different, but its legacy is already secure. It will forever stand as a symbol of how even a single building project can ignite a storm of suspicion, pride, and power struggles. This is the hidden cost of geopolitics. Not always fought with armies or weapons, but with planning applications, council votes, and quiet intelligence reports. The great embassy controversy between the UK and China may not yet be over. In fact, it may only be the beginning of a much longer story, a story about how the world's powers confront each other not just across oceans or battlefields, but in the very heart of cities we walk through every day. And so, the question lingers. In the air, will the Royal Mint site become a place of diplomacy, a fortress of surveillance, or a permanent monument to mistrust? Only time, and the choices of leaders on both sides, will provide the answer.